If we buy a car wrong, it never gets right. It doesn't matter how good your F&I is. It doesn't matter how good the sales team is. If you don't have an attitude of continuous improvement, you will get lost in the shuffle.
So math and science doesn't lie. But thoughts and feelings definitely lead us down a different hole that maybe isn't so profitable. That's where I think the industry is kind of struggling to figuring out what does that look like.
I want you to have a very robust direct from consumer program. Equally, you need to have a very robust acquisition strategy when it comes to off-site auctions. And here's why.
Are you wasting your time and money on inefficiencies in the business? Are sales down and lead conversion rates are low? Are you having problems building or maintaining inventory levels? What does it really take to win in the automotive industry?
Get the cars that make sense for your store rather than just wishing at an auction. So it gives you that better control.
With over 25 years of experience, Darrell Steed isn't just another industry voice. He's the guy who's out there solving real problems for dealers just like you.
They'll even say in the Pacific Northwest where you're at that it's a tougher market. It's, it's tougher to find cars. The market's a little bit softer. And then in the midst of all this, your turn doubled and your profit's up 75%.
Yes.
The truth hurts only when it should. Are you ready to hear the truths? Darrell is here to unpack the hard truths and the proven strategies that will take your dealership from struggling to soaring. And he is taking it all in the streets, with real talk, open dialogue, unfiltered conversations. This is the podcast series, Street Smarts, powered by SmartWolf Consulting.
Welcome, everybody, to Street Smarts, powered by SmartWolf Consulting. I'm your host, Darrell Steed, and today we are diving deep into the fast-paced world of automotive inventory sourcing by industry titan Frank Knox. Now, Frank Knox has over 20 years of experience, and I can personally say that he has revolutionized acquisition strategies with one of the largest used car operations that we're going to talk about in the world, from offsite auctions, direct to customer appraisals. He has a very innovative approach, not just to maximize inventory, but to also prepare profitability and being competitive in that marketplace by doing something different. Now, I want you to join us when we explore Frank's insights, his crafting of dynamic pricing strategies and building high-performance teams to get dealers where they need to be. And then not only that, preparing for the ever-changing landscape of the automotive industry, specifically in used, because we know that that is one of those things that changes all the time. And whether you're an industry veteran, just getting started, there's something here for everyone to boost their street smarts, to be better prepared to obviously take that on. So buckle up for this episode with knowledge, strategies, and inspiration. Let's get it going. Frank, thank you so much for joining the podcast. I love having you here and looking forward to it.
Darrell, I appreciate the opportunity. Pleasure meeting you back at Used Car Palooza, and we stay connected. So I'm excited for this morning.
So, Frank, I know that you are the vice president for Unique Auto Sourcing, but if someone was watching this first time, or they are just used to the typical ways to go about doing things, please tell us exactly what Unique Auto Sourcing does, because it is something that is conceptually different than most of the avenues that we've seen before.
Yeah, so happy to share a little bit about the company and how the company came to be. So about a year ago, when I left off lease only, Justin Campbell, who is the owner of Unique Auto Sales, one of the largest wholesalers in the Southeast, approached me, and we both had a common idea. And that idea was that more times than not, we have used car managers and individuals that are, trying to source inventory. And, in some cases, there's a lack of experience. But in more cases than not, what we find is that there's just a lack of time. Dealers don't have the bandwidth to go out there and sit and watch the auctions for 10 to 12 hours to find a handful of cars. So we thought, what if we could form a virtual buying team that could go out there and help these dealers to source the inventory for them? And so that's where the idea of Unique Auto Sourcing was born, because we had a wealth of experience on the wholesale side of going out and acquiring inventory from a wholesale side and then running that inventory through the auction. But what if we could put a team together that had the experience level to go out and buy cars for retail establishments? And so we decided to go out and start recruiting. And we were fortunate enough to land a couple of individuals that have 25 years of experience each in the acquisition space, tons of time with CarMax, ACV, Stockwave, and V Auto. And so we have that experience that we can look at, and we can start to layer that experience with the experience we have on the wholesale side that will help dealers to, number one, understand the market, right? So we can provide them real-time data of saying, this is exactly what the wholesale market is doing. This is how cars are selling. We have the experience of a team to go out there and source the inventory for you. But we had to take a step back and we had to think about, well, how are we coming up with the list for these buyers to go out there and find? It doesn't do us any good if our buyers are out there fishing for Chevy Equinoxes and what you sell well is a Ford Escape. So we need to understand your dealership. We need to understand the dynamics of your market. And more importantly, we need to craft a buy plan that is baked in data. So looking at your sales pace, looking at your days supply, looking at what you have in current inventory, how long it takes for cars to hit the lot. All of those things matter if we're going to build a robust buy plan.
I think that is actually, you said two things that I definitely want to spend a moment on, but that I thought was interesting was, one is that you said building that robust, like your merchandising strategy, like what you're going to retail. I think that a lot of people, just based on, I'm guessing people you talk to, I talk to all the time, is they like, oh, I want to buy cars, whether it's service drive, auction, buy centers, private party. There's all these avenues. And they're like, well, yeah, I just want to buy them. But they never slow down or take a moment or think about your buying strategy really comes back to how you sell vehicles. Like if you don't have that strategy of understanding what's going to sell, how fast it's going to sell, and you don't spend the time in that data, well, you can go buy all kinds of cars, but it doesn't much matter if you're not either the right end user, or let's say you bought a car that maybe you're not, you don't have a liquidation strategy for that. So I love the fact that you guys have went and got some industry guys that have experience. So they've seen the rise and fall of the market a couple of times with 25 years of experience. And like you said, the CarMaxes and the ACVs and the Stockways. So they're not only just industry guys, but they've also been part of some very dynamic strategies of progression. So we're not talking about the 25, 30 years of experience. That is, I've only stood in an auction and I used a little blue book and I never used technology. We're talking about guys that have used the technology, the algorithms, the science, the data, because what we do know about the car industry, whether we like to acknowledge it or not, but math and science doesn't lie. So, but thoughts and feelings definitely lead us down a different hole that maybe isn't so profitable. So I think that's great. And obviously I know about where you started and where you came from, but I think it'd be great for people to understand that is that you obviously started at, we will call it, the industry villain, so to say, of like, CarMax is where, you had a lot of experience and success, but I think it's great because CarMax was something that people laughed out of a room when it first came out, saying this would never survive. And now everyone's going, man, we should have done exactly what CarMax did.
Yeah.
But tell us a little bit about just seeing the maturation of how CarMax took that and then how that actually plays into dealers taking control back by looking at something like unique auto sourcing or that experience of understanding the math and science to be profitable and for long periods of time.
Yeah. So, I'll go back. So I started back at CarMax, in 2003. And, in 2003, things were very different at CarMax. CarMax was not, the giant in the industry that they are now. But the one thing that we always held true to was that we knew that there was always going to be continuous improvement and there was going to be continuous change. that was ingrained in us from the very start. And the industry didn't lie, right? Like from 2003, we hit 2008 and beyond, and then we hit a pandemic. It's always been changing and evolving and evolving. And if you don't have an attitude of continuous improvement, you will get lost in the shuffle. So, I remember those days when we were very focused on how do we acquire inventory direct from consumer? How do we build a robust appraisal process that is unrivaled in the industry? And at the time I was a buyer in training, and it was a little bit frustrating because it seemed like it felt like every day, every week we were changing something in that process. It wasn't that way, but it felt that way. But at the end of the day, we started to understand that what we were doing was we were on a data gathering mission of what works and what doesn't work. And over time, so fast forward in my 17 and a half years there, you saw that appraisal process change. And you saw not only did the appraisal process change, but the level of accountability ramped up in terms of what we were doing in the appraisal lane, how we were doing it, how we were appraising cars, how we were valuing cars. But we didn't stop there. That same sort of energy was put into the off-site arena as well. And all of a sudden you saw us go from, hey, we're not buying a car with any paint work to, you know what, if it's got some paint work, but we've thoroughly checked that car out, we're going to buy it. And so it's no secret when you go to an auction and you see these CarMax guys, you can always find them. You can always spot them because they have a clipboard. And why do they have a clipboard? Because all their research and all the data and information, they did it ahead of time. They didn't show up at the auction at 9 a.m. and start bidding on cars. They got there at 9 a.m. the day before and started walking cars and understanding what it was that they were going to buy and reviewing those cars, and showed up in the lane with a number on any car that met their standards. They weren't willing to turn that car away. What they knew was, this is the value that it's worth to me. This is what I'm willing to pay for that car. And so CarMax changed and it evolved over time. And, and I got to see that. And most recently, shortly before I left CarMax, I was responsible for helping to roll out Max Offer, which most dealers, they're going to, if you don't know Max Offer now, you're going to hear about Max Offer because it's all about business to business and trying to acquire that inventory at the source, not go to the auction. How do I acquire that inventory at the source? The dealer that would have run that car at the auction, I'm going to go and acquire that car directly from that dealer. So again, now you have, Darrell, and I think you're excellent when you talk about this in terms of, hey, when you're talking about a buying center, we're not just talking about direct from consumer. We're talking about direct from consumer. We're talking about the auction. We're talking about direct from another dealer. We're talking about rental cars. We're talking about the entire ecosystem of acquisitions. And that's what, when I talk to some of my dealer clients, that's the message that, hey, I'm here to help you acquire inventory. And yes, we have a virtual buying team, but let's talk about these other channels, because what you do in these other channels determines the level of success that you have when you go to the auction.
Yeah. And I think that's it. It's very interesting that, everyone just naturally assumes, right, because I get associated with, I build buying centers, and I've built some very highly profitable, effective ones. And that they're like, oh, you're talking about private party or, like third-party lead providers that you then are looking to sell the car. And I'm like, no, there's the acquisition wheel, which I will, and you'll see this come up in this podcast, and so that they can see as I'm talking about this. But there's an acquisition wheel, and it's got 7 sections, and it's not one of those things where it's like buying center means, oh, private party. That is a piece of a buying center. And it's funny, we were talking before this, is that's the new shiny toy, which I'm going to come back to in a minute, because we're going to talk about how the car business has issues with grabbing onto stuff here in a minute. But it also says rental purchases. It says auction. It says service drive. It says customer base. Why? Because the buying center is we'll call it the trigger word or the action word. Just like there's two other words that people like to say all the time in our industry that it's like noise, but there's no real understanding to it, is EVs. So we hear the word EV and we're just naturally like, oh my gosh, it's a buzzword and we all want to be, but we don't actually understand what like, we just hear it and it means something. And then AI, right? We say, AI, well, what version of AI? And what is AI doing for you? And what is it? And so we hear these and we're like, ooh, it's like, oh my gosh. Well, when we were talking before we jumped off on this, was that buying centers is the new, we'll call it trigger word. Well, I've been building and operating buying centers since 2010. So I find this magically entertaining because I'm like, we're 14 years into this. And I built one in Fresno, California that was rivaling the DG group at the same time. They had 13 stores. I had one, and I was doing damn near the same amount of stuff. But this is 2010 and 2011. And it's funny because it goes back to the, like with CarMax when they first came out, no one thought it would work. And everyone said, this is no way it's going to do it. And they constantly evolved and changed. And it took probably 15 years before people were like, man, CarMax is like, not like the industry titan they are now, but they were like a known entity. And then now they are an industry titan. But I think it's hilarious that it's 15 years, 20 years. And people are like, no, that'll never work. Rather than adapting to that change and going like, how do we get ahead of this? How do we drive the bus? How do we do this? And that's why I thought it was interesting when we met at Used Car Palooza, is the way you were doing this is you and I both know, and we deal with this all the time. It's like, well, there's an expense to that. Well, making money is never free, but more importantly is assuming you don't get something like you do, or you don't build and I like, we'll take the word buying center out in an acquisition strategy, right? Because there is multiple pieces to this and you can't roll them all at once. You've got to like kind of figure out where you're going to do each one. But if you're not going to pay to do that and you're not going to invest in that, so you're going to continue doing the same behavior that has led you to having a cardiac algorithm, like looks like this, that you're right. Like we all know what this does. Okay. It causes gray hair, stress, any type of other health issues. What if we had something that looked like this and then just slowly just kind of went up, but it was more this, it was forecastable because we used facts and data. And so I think it's interesting when you look at the challenge of what we're dealing with, because I do agree. I think people, I see it all the time. I have people I work with. I have softwares that I work with that are like, let's get away from the auction. Now, listen, I 100% agree the auction is probably one of the more expensive places to buy inventory right now. That's also because, I mean, COVID destroyed anything we ever were going to know about inventory and made it into an area where compression is just crazy now. So you have to think about it in a different way of profitability, I believe, of yes, I still want to make money in those cars, but our margins are going to be thinner until we've sold enough cars to move the market back out. What I think is interesting is if we know that the auction, I don't think you ever can replace the auction. I think it's one of those dynamic things of, like you said, is you're always going to need it, whether it's now, and we were talking about it before, is 3 years from now, 4 years from now, but maybe you don't need it as much right this second and you want to be surgical. But you're still going to need to have a strategy, because what if, and I know this is crazy to say something like this, you have a private party acquisition strategy and you have the ICOs and the AccuTrades and you're even doing your service drive. I mean, and you got it all dialed in and you only get 60 cars that month and you needed 100 because there's like, again, your bidding platform and how you're going to buy a car has to go up and down based on your strategy too, if you don't have enough cars, right? So you still put yourself in that area of reactive.
Yeah.
If inventory keeps compressing. So I think it's a holistic nature of understanding how do we make sure that we are never forced to do anything, but we're proactive to every approach, right? Like, okay, if I know like, I got Frank helping me with my auction so I can go after 20 to 30 cars that are very unique to what I need, then I have a private party, then I have my service driver, like, okay, now you have an acquisition strategy a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. You may need to adapt it and tweak it, as we talked about changing, but you don't have to abandon anything. You just have to adapt and tweak based on what you're looking for, which I think that's where I think the industry is kind of struggling to figuring out what does that look like.
Yeah, I think you touched on a couple things, right? So, I coined it, the industry gets stuck in a place where at times we see the shiny new toy And we go after that shiny new object, right? That shiny new toy, we got to have it. And right now, that is direct from consumer, right? Like everyone, any place you go, you're hearing direct from consumer. And so I always use some caution when I'm talking to dealers. Yes, I want you to have a very robust direct from consumer program. Equally, you need to have a very robust acquisition strategy when it comes to offsite auctions. And here's why. If I have a customer that comes into my store and let's say it's a Chevy Equinox and I think that car is worth 16 grand, right? I'm going to put 16 grand on that for that customer because I can't go any lower without jeopardizing my reputation with that customer. And chances are I probably won't win, right? Like I won't. But let's say I'm at the auction and I'm standing in the lane and I'm the only one in this lane and it's a repo car and it's towards the end of the auction. I'm in Chicago now, so it gets snowy and it's a snowy day and nobody's there. Am I going to offer that bank rep, that rental company, 16 grand for that car? No, I'm not. My job when I go to the auction is I'm going to try to rip every car that I can because that's the auction, right? Someone wants to outbid me, fantastic. But I'm okay with putting 15 grand on that car at the auction and saying, hey, if I buy it here, great. If I don't, no love lost. My reputation as a wholesaler or as a buyer is still intact. But when I'm in the appraisal lane, I have to be ultra competitive in order to buy that car and not jeopardize my reputation. There is a world that's coming. We all know this. And I think, Spisak says it well, like, hey, let's stop being surprised about things that we know are going to happen. He said that, right? Something to that effect.
Yep.
Well, look, we know what's happening right now with repos. We know repos delinquencies are rising. Repos are going to start to increase. And what happens when repos start to flood the auctions? Well, ultimately, banks just want to unload those cars. Well, at some point, the auction prices will start to come back down to where they make more sense. And do you want to be prepared right now for what you know might come and is coming? Or are you going to wait a year from now when repos start hitting the market to say, now we got to go to the auction. I got to find somebody who can go buy those cars for me. No, to me, when you talk about acquisitions, they go hand in hand. Wherever I can get that car from whatever channel, the best that I possibly can get, the best price I can get it for, that's where I'm going. That's where I have to go. And that's what's going to help me to drive profitability. So yes, there is a path forward when we talk about direct from consumer. But I equally believe that you still need to be in the auctions and looking for those cars and those deals that are out there. Look, CarMax has a great and a very robust acquisition strategy. And a piece of that acquisition strategy is, like I said earlier, they buy cars at auction still. They buy cars direct from dealers still. The big chunk of what they buy is from the consumer. And that's what we want to look at and we want to model. You said something before that, we look at, there were years ago where, people looked at CarMax and said, hey, look, they're the villain of the industry. And the reality is I look at CarMax and I say, look, CarMax is a bit of the white, the knight in, shining armor in the business, right? They're on the white horse and they've been singing the song loud and clear for years and years. Hey guys, this is what works. This is what works. This is how we do it. It's just recently that people have embraced it and said, yeah, I probably need to take a look and follow some of what they're doing. And how do I do that? Right.
Well, I think that's it, right? Like we could use another one that maybe we'll say the older generation would understand, right? Because there was something that happened about 24 years ago. Right. And, with Y2K and the world was going to end and the fear bubble was hilarious. And, internet was out, but it wasn't like this crazy thing yet. Like it wasn't this like really like everyone's in it, but we had it. And then when internet really made that push, I remember hearing comments. I remember seeing stuff of like the internet's the devil. It's going to ruin the business. It'll never make things better. Well, let's just look at the science and data of it and pull up any study. It doesn't matter which one. So even if you're like, well, that one's not real, pull up another one. We've sold more cars since internet came out than we ever sold before. And because it brought it to a wide amount of people that could then search multiple stores, because typically you went into a store and you had to go to each store and find the best deal. Now you can surf on the web and you were able to do that. But I think that's the same thing with CarMax. Like I remember seeing it and I was like, man, this is kind of genius. And knowing the story about Circuit City to CarMax, and like, I was like, this is going to be innovative. I didn't know like when I first saw it, if it was going to be like cutting edge or if it's going to be, but I knew that it had a place. And what I think when you say like the white knight or the shining example is, people, it takes them so long to realize or to acknowledge like maybe I wasn't right. Like, and using Spizak as an example, like we sold 10 cars in the 70s and 10 cars was the average in the 80s. And then the night, like, why are we so surprised the average is still 10 cars? Because we're still doing the same processes. But
Right.
when you look at CarMax is, okay, if they give a number, and what I like about it is it's not like, let's say, and they don't have this process, but like Cox, right? Cox Automotive is privately owned. So you have no idea what they're doing. Right. And with the CarMax is public. So when you see they buy these cars, whether they're from dealers or auctions or private party or whatever it is, and then you see they're making this profit, yes, slightly different strategy than a typical franchise, but they're making profit and they have to show it. You can't, like, the argument's over of, well, what they do doesn't make them money. No, guys, their stock goes up every quarter. Okay. Maybe only a couple of pennies, but it's like, it is one of those more mature companies that like you don't lose money on this. To include COVID, you did not lose money on this company. So I think it's interesting when you look at that as like, okay, they've given you a path, whether or not you want to embrace it or do a different version of them or a piece of it. But then you look at that as, okay, let's say you're not the right end user. We hear a lot of that conversation. We'll call it, I'm agnostic about it because I think any vehicle is the right end user for the right strategy. Maybe not retail, but I think you could buy any car and have the right liquidation strategy. So, but if you're not the right end user and you have like Max Offer or you have an AccuTrade or an ICO or any of these that have these guarantees baked into them, then like, what are you afraid of, right? Like if you go to the auction, you make a mistake, or you take in a trade, you make a mistake, or you buy private party, you have these things to where you can say, this gives you an idea. And I think that's the thing is like when you look at auctions, I agree with you. And I think the missing piece of this, when people understand this so that we don't get anyone confused here, guys, when you go to the auction, what Frank said is very insightful. And I don't want you guys to miss, like he made it sound super simple, but there's so many layers to him saying, I would bid 15 on this repo or this bank car, but I would buy it for 16 at my store. Well, it's the same money, just in a different line. 15, then you have the fees and the transport. So you'll be in at 16, 16.5. So maybe a hair more, but that's why you buy it less at the auction. That's why you have someone that understands that no, because you have fees that go with it. Okay. But if you know that car is a fast mover, 30, 60-day mover, depending on your methodology, or if you are one of the longer ones and it works for you, you get those cars for multiple reasons. One, you know it's going to turn. Two, for instance, if you have a fast spinning velocity model, you need the auction. For the simple fact is you can't guarantee you're going to get enough cars from any of these other sources. Is I buy a Chevy Equinox, and let's just say I'm at a Toyota store. I get a Chevy Equinox on trade. I get it through the shop, boom, and that thing sells in 5 days. Well, obviously there's a market there. Well, I go look at my private party opportunities. We don't have any in the listings. There's nothing there. Obviously, I'm at a Toyota store, so the chances they're coming from the service drive are pretty thin. I can be on the hope train for a trade, or I can go to the auction and say, I'm looking for all 2020s and 2021 Equinoxes that I can acquire at X range, whatever it may be.
That's right.
That's where I think people are missing that in the industry, the auction has been very reactive. I'm out of cars. I got to go get it. I need these cars. And so there's no real math and science to it. It's just a feeling, a thought like, oh, I think that, and there's not that science and data that your company puts into it, or the good operators. There are good operators that are very meticulous about this. Tony Lucas, for one, like he's like, yeah. And Glenn, like, he's like, I use the auction because he's like, if I just sold this car, I'm going to go replace that car. Like, I'm going to get that car again because I have 5 other leads. Like if you use the tools like a lot pop or whatever, so they're like, I had 6 leads on this car. If I go replace it, I could sell this car again and tell the people I've got another one coming in, same color. That's where I think the math and science of where the auction's necessary. And I agree with you right now. Yeah, it's tough. I've been on the auction 3 days this week. And I will tell you that if you need a reminder of like getting your head kicked in and seeing what prices are bringing, just go watch it. Don't even bid, just watch it and just see. But I think that's the surgical nature of having like experts like you guys of understanding what you're going after for that store is, but what about in a year from now when things loosen up a little bit? What about when we've sold enough new cars again and leases start coming back in? Because that was the real compression, right? We oversold new, we oversold used, markets went up on both, and now people are buried in both levels, right? They're buried in new and in used, so they can't get out. So we've elongated the trade-in cycle. It used to be 3 to 4 years. Well, used used to be 2 to 4. Now used is 4 to 6 because they paid so much for the cars they got. They have to get, like, they can't get out of them. Same thing with new. Well, as things change, leases come back in, that you start getting to a better position. It's like, okay, now we have more trade opportunities or private party opportunities or service opportunities. But then we also have auction opportunities because there are going to be people that say, I took in the Equinox, and they're like, I'm a Toyota store. And I'm like, that's just not really our bread and butter. So they're going to say, let's auction it because that's not for them or their market. And then that gives you that opportunity. So I think it's really interesting to look and say, one, are we adapting? Let's maybe not use the word change because apparently that's like a fear word. Like we say change and people freak out. Like, oh my God, not again. Yeah. Let's say adapt or evolve because we would hate to like scare anyone off with one conversation. But I mean, when we think about it, okay, let's say like my dad's dad, right? Like they had telephones and probably telegraphs, right? Like, I mean, we're talking, and then you get to telephones, then you get to faxes, then you get to internet. Now we're in text, and then we're in video and social mediums. We didn't change anything. We adapted how we communicate to that device. New cars. I mean, think about new cars when you bought them. I remember the car my mom had no seat belts. Your seat belt was essentially your mom's arm across you. Like, so when you think about that, right? Like we have to adapt and evolve, but where do you start? Like, where does someone start and say, okay, we want to be comprehensive and take the buzzwords out, the buying center, the direct from consumer, off the street purchases, whatever version they want to church it up with and say, we're going to call it something different. But where do you start? Like, and I think it's that when you get a team like you, or like when people call me and, or they want versions of what I do in a basic way, you need to have somebody that understands that and lives in that, right? Because yeah, you live how to sell cars, but now you're talking about outside of your trade process, which may or may not work, you're talking about evolving something that you've never done before. It's always been these very kind of focuses. They've never been real focused on how to do it, right?
Yeah. So I work very closely with John Ellis, and we have the automotive advisor team, right? Yep. And the automotive advisor team is this collection of industry experts that are out there, right? Like David Long's a part of it. I'm a part of it. Duran Cage, like some guys who know areas of the business that can really help you. But even let me take a step back away from that. One of the things that John and I sat down and we started trying to figure out is, every major conglomerate out there that's going out and trying to acquire inventory walks in on day one with a buying plan, right? CarMax, we would sit down, we'd figure out, hey, every week, what is the buying plan? What does it look like? What do we sell? What do we need to change? What are we going to go out? And that's just the numbers side of things, right? That's just to get to how many that we need, right? When I was at Off Lease Only, like I don't want to lose, that in this conversation, because Off Lease Only, one of the largest independents in the country, we would go out on some weeks, 700 to 1,000 cars off site. Well, you're not going to do that in a week without having a buy plan and understanding that that's the actual number. You can't guess at that and say, hey, I'm just going to go out and buy that many cars. Well, forget 1,000 a week. Forget, when I was in the Midwest managing that territory for CarMax, it was 1,400 a week. But even if it's 14 cars a week, you really should be thinking about is this the right number of cars that I need to go out there and source? And how do you do that? Well, it's got to be baked in logic and it's got to be baked in data. And this is where John and I started, working together, because he would sit down and he would say, okay, great. You need to go out and buy this many cars based on your sales pace, based on your day supply, based on all these things. You need 15 or 14 cars, I said. Well, the dealers would go out and they find hey, I'm going to go out and buy 14 cars. John said, I need 14 cars. Well, they weren't the right 14 cars. And so now we've created aging. And so that's where my team can come in. And it does take that time of digging into all of the information and all of the data. So I'll spend time looking into your vAuto, looking at your lot walk data if you have lot walk, looking at your AccuTrade or your Auto Trader data, looking at Car Gurus to understand where are the SRPs and VDPs occurring, right? What's selling in the market? If I look at your strategy page in vAuto, I can see that, hey, look, the market is over, the market is really focused on $25,000 and under cars, and they're focused on these make models, but you're stocking something completely different. Well, that's why we're not getting the sales we want, and that's why we're aging, is because we didn't build a buy plan to tell us we only needed 14. We used our gut to say, hey, we're going to go buy 20 because we felt like that was the right number. And then after we said we're going to buy 20, we went out and bought the wrong 20 because we didn't look at all the information. And I call it reading the tea leaves, right? Like, we didn't read the tea leaves to say, look, I need 20 cars, but here are the specific make model, the specific trim, the mileage, the price point. Here's where I want to be at cost to market on that car. Here's where I want to be at, whether it's a clean EVHR or not, whether it's, Canadian, am I open to Canadian cars? Am I open to structural cars? Like, all of those conversations need to have taken place before you even think about stepping into an auction. And if you don't have those conversations, if you don't have that sort of plan, I would say use extreme caution on even going to the auction and putting your hand up in the air, because you're probably going to buy something that you clearly did not need.
No, it's interesting you say that, right? Because this actually ties in really well to like how you start, where you start. And I think it's, I really prescribe to like, okay, you guys want to evolve, you want to adapt, you want to change something. I always say, like, before you're going to do any of these radical changes, always look at pay plans, because pay plans typically dictate behavior. So you're going to change something, and then like you wonder why your managers don't embrace it or your salespeople don't embrace it. Well, I'm not saying always, but a good percentage of the time you're like, oh, hey, you're paying them on if they make like pounders or gross, and now you're moving to a volume model. Well, that changes things. Or you're on a volume model, but then like you said, you buy the wrong cars, and then you're like, okay, we're not really selling them because they sit. So what I think is interesting when you say do the research is, like, when we're talking about where you start or how people can be helped or where they can do this, is like, it's almost looking at like a used car manager, or if it was a GM looking down, is maybe your used car manager has to be redefined, or director, what it is like, because again, I know how many people I talk to, and when I say, well, what does it look like on your retail side? And me, I started as a sales guy, worked a finance closer, sales director, then used car director for a large group. And oddly enough, I learned how to buy used cars, which is abnormal from anything I've seen normally, because I was really good at the merchandising side and the retail. Like, I understood the marketing of it so well that it was just reverse engineer. Like, okay, if I want to sell it for 20, what do I need to buy the car to, like, and work backwards, right? And I didn't hear that phrase that the profit was made in the buy till I'd been a used car director for like 3 years. Because I didn't look at the buy. I was going like this: we're going to sell it for $29,995. I need to buy this car for X. And it was all based on profitability. And then I knew if I bought it for 24, that was optimal. I could pay up to 25.5, right? And because I knew I was going to make my fixed stops, my back end, whatever it may be. So what I think is interesting is, one, so I've created this mastermind group, but because for this exact reason. But I think it's interesting is like, where do used car managers start? Because how many of them actually spend time on understanding the retail strategy, the third party stuff, the advertising, the what they're doing? Or are they the guys that get into vAuto and they buy cars, they get them through the shop, and then they set them in there, but they don't actually look at all the other prisms that are required to make these educational like decisions? And
Yeah.
so where do they start in that? And then two is maybe it's like you have buyers, or like you bring in a team like you and like, hey, Frank's going to handle our auction strategies, right? And he does this. And yeah, it doesn't, like, maybe there's an expense to it, but you go, but now my used car manager, my merchandise, whatever you want to call him, they really hone in on, if he gets us the stuff and you have all these other apparatuses off the street, service and everything else, if we get this inventory, then really you're just honing in on how do we turn it the fastest, right? Because we all know turn. And if you don't know, the fastest you turn, I shouldn't say the faster you turn. Having effective churn is ideal for maximum profitability, because there are stores that churn too fast. Like they could actually raise their prices a bit because they leave money on the table, and sometimes do it by conscious thought. And some just are like, they didn't know. So I think it's interesting that we don't either as ourselves, right? Or companies in their people don't invest in making sure that, are you getting them the right education? Are you putting them in the right spots of, hey, like look into this, look into that. Like we were at Used Car Palooza. We talked to all those people, and I remember putting the challenge out there. I'm like, hey guys, by a raise of hands, how many of you guys have one of us on retainer? And there was 2 people in this whole room that raised their hand. And I was like, okay, so wait a minute. You're here to learn about used cars, but you don't have a specialist. You don't have a unique person that can, so you're going to leave here and do what? Hope that what we talked about today, that you just have the master plan and putting it together. And we all know where hope gets you, right? That's a wish without a plan. Or do you bring somebody in and say, look, we want to put plan to action. And what's the worst thing that happens? And this is what I tell people. The worst thing that happens is you invest in the specialist, they come in, and you end up at the exact same spot you were at. That's the worst that happens. The best that can happen is something different happens. You actually start making more money or moving forward, which typically is what happens, because when you put focus and drive, you typically get better results. But I think it's interesting when you talk about that is all the time it takes for merchandising and all the time it takes for the analytics and the science and the studying, because we're not talking about you just turn it on and hit a button. I mean, you can. That is definitely a way to do things. But
so it's funny. It's funny when I was at Off Lease Only, and I had the opportunity to work very closely with a guy who was the COO of the company, Alan McLaren, and one thing he said to me, just a wealth of experience, tons of knowledge. One thing he said to me once when we were sitting down, he goes, "You think like a buyer," and I said, "Well, yeah." I took a lot of pride in that. Like, yeah. I am a buyer. That's what I do. He goes, but you're not a buyer. You're a retailer. And you need to think about being a retailer and think about when you buy something, what is actually going to sell? Not, hey, I bought it and I got a great deal on it. Well, the great deal doesn't matter if you can't sell it. And so, in that moment, I started thinking about cars a lot differently. And that requires, to your point, that requires a ton of research. It requires sitting down. So I remember, if I go back, I remember sitting down on a Sunday afternoon, usually started around 4 or 5 o'clock. And, I'd stop, take a quick break, eat some dinner. But from that time that I sat down in the afternoon on Sunday till, probably 10, 11 o'clock at night, it was sitting down. And it took so long because I was planning for, large biplanes, 700, 800 cars.
Phenomenal amount of cars,
But it took so long to sit down and understand each of our, 5 locations, eventually 6 locations, what those stores needed in order to be successful. And then we would have a Monday meeting between myself and the COO every single Monday, like repetition, 9 a.m. We're meeting. We're going to talk about what is it that we're going to go out there and buy. Now, the great thing is that after we did that manually for so long, we started to develop software internally that would help direct us to those cars, right? Like, hey, this is what your shopping list needs to look like. Well, guess who else has a shopping list when they go out to the auctions? CarMax, Carvana, Echo Park. Every one of those large companies have shopping lists before they set foot in an auction. They know what they need to buy. They know what they're going to have to pay for that inventory. And so I beg us as an industry, again, this is where we have to come along with the giants. not just CarMax, but every other dealer that's out there that's having success at the auctions, they start with having that game plan before they go to the auction. They know what they're going to buy. They know how they're going to buy it, and they have a list before they even put a hand in the air for a car. It's gone are the days where, hey, man, that car looks really good. It's rolling through the lane. You know what? I think that price works. I'll buy it.
Well, I think it's funny you say that because so I know a guy, he's been a buyer for probably about 25 years. He's one of the best I've seen. He's really good. But he'll call me now. He buys for some of these bigger groups. So we'll call it their retail strategy has a little bit more leeway than, let's say, a single point store. Mm-hmm. So with that being said, you can make some mistakes that maybe if you made in a single point store would get you that he could get away with sometimes. But what I thought was interesting, and it's when you say that, like he'll buy a Chevy Tahoe. And I'll use this one for example, because 20 years ago, this was the ideal car as an example. You'd be like, hey man, I bought this $7,000 back a book. I ripped it. And you're like sitting there, like wanting to pat yourself on the back. You're like, hey bro, they're retailing for $6,000 back a book. But they didn't think of that. They looked at book and went like this. And every time I heard it, I'm like, well, hey, what's the book value? I'm like, what does it matter? Like book has nothing to do with anything other than for the banks in most cases, but it's so you rip this car. What are they retailing for? And I see it a lot with like enterprise cars, Enterprise, Hertz, Avis, all these. They're like, hey, Darrell, I'll get you this really good deal. I can get you this car for whatever. Right. And they're like, they always say it too, $2,000 back a book. So I go, yes, give me the VIN number, put it in. And I go, buddy, you're trying to sell it to me for $15,000. They're retailing for $14,500. Like, he's like, well, where are you seeing this? I'm like, in all the market data. Oh, go look at everyone. Hey, buddy, you have it on your own site for $14,900. You're trying to sell it to me for $15,500. What is going on here? So I think when you say that, and I think the like misconception, which we should tie in here is, just because people have this whole off the street purchase buy center, right? And obviously that's where I specialize in because I can go to the auction, but I have no problem admitting if you and I go to the auction, okay, I'm over my skis if you do it and I do it, okay? Listen, I'm going to use the data, but you have way more of that than I do, right? But private party, do you really think like, yes, if someone walks in and wants to sell their car, you have a buying center, you're going to buy that car because you have to protect your reputation. But when you're out hunting and you're not hunting stuff that doesn't like, it's the same thing. You have to put in the time to book the car, look at the VHR, look at the market strategy. What are you going to bid? And whether you're bidding full rate at the top, if you're bidding with someone to negotiate with, however you're going about that, it's the same principle as like, guys, you have to like have a plan. If you just go like this, hey, Darrell, I need you to buy us 70 cars this month from the buying center. Which 70? And what are we going after? And how are we going to get there? Now, obviously, the buying center is slightly different than the auction because you're going to have to look at a lot more cars than, let's say, an acquisition side. But it's, okay, we need to make 100 appointments. And 70 of them have to show to get 40. So it's like, okay, to get 70, we got to make 200 people. So on and so like, it's still a numbers game of understanding the methodology of how do we get to 70. And if you just say in the day, all right, guys, we need 70 this month. So go to work. Okay, let's get them. And there's no rhyme or reason to what you're going after or how you're going to communicate with it. Like now you're on the hope plan, right? And the hope plan is, that's guaranteed disappointment. Unless of course you hit you get lucky one time, right? Like, oops, I got lucky and just ran into everybody that said yes. So that's
a challenge.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting to say, like, you have to really think about this in a different way and not saying, what we're doing is wrong or is that like, no, I just think there's more effective ways. There's different ways to look at it now. As a used car manager isn't what it used to be, whereas like you just buy and you hit pricing. No, I profess like, hey, if you're going to have pricing in a store, it should not be anyone that's buying the cars. Let someone else price them so that they're not like, because again, you get yourself tied up in that. Now the person buying them needs to understand the merchandising side of it. But if they go in and price it, I have yet to meet someone that prices cars that doesn't go like, man, we paid a little bit too much for that. Let's go ahead and let's just raise it up just a little bit. Like, I don't want to price it and lose money, so I'm going to price it just a bit higher. And you go like this, why are you pricing it like that? Well, because we paid too much. What you paid has nothing to do with what this car sells for. But I also think that goes into understanding if you make fixed ops, F&I, front end profit. Like these are 3 profit centers within a used car dynamic, and then potential trade conversion of that you need to be aware of. You're not going to, in today's market, have the ability of making front end profit at the scales we used to on every car. Not saying on some cars you're going to still be okay, but like on every car to think you're like, oh, I'm going to buy every car that I get and make $3,000 on the front and $2,000 on the back and this, and that. You can certainly have that, but then tailor your expectations of what you're going to acquire, because like you said, it's still, you have to be competitive. If they go to CarMax.com and Carvana and Echo Park and all these other ones that are out there, because there has to be at least 25 of these things now. And I say those 3 first, because those are the 3 that are most branded and well-known, and their offers are over $500. And then you hit them up $4,000 lower than that. Not only do you not have validity, you're not getting the car, but now you've got basically a negative intender talking about you in a bad way, right? So that's where I also think the auction gives you that affordability of, hey, you want to try to rip a car because you've looked at your analytics and said, look, I ain't paying more than 12, and you've done all the math. You can give that offer of 12, and if they say no, I leave here, no harm, no foul. I give someone 12 on an open market, and they got 14 from everywhere else. They're going to be like this. Yeah, these criminals are trying to rip me off, right? And so I think there's a balance of understanding. Yes, off the street acquisition, I think, is vitally important. Yes, service drive is vitally important. Changing your trade process to align with these things is the most important, but auction serves the purpose of where you have a lot more bandwidth of decision making. That does not mean you're going to acquire the car, but you have much more like you said, surgically going after stuff. And if you don't get it, you have a big list. So you know that, like, the reason you make bigger lists is because you know you're not going to get all those cars. And let's say you made a list of 100 and you got 20, the first 20 you got, great, you're done. You got the 20 you needed if that's what you were looking for. But you made the list for 100 because you're anticipating like it's going to take 100 of these to find 20 or 10 or whatever number that ends up coming out to.
Thank you. And that's the other piece, right? Like, so many, I've talked to so many dealers who, will approach the auctions and think that if I go into the auction and I have these 5 cars I'm going after, I'm going to, hopefully walk away with 1 or 2. Well, that math just doesn't.
It doesn't matter.
Like, what do they say? The math is math.
Nothing. Yeah.
So you need to approach it as, look, if I want to buy 10 cars, I'm gonna more than likely have to have 100 cars on paper, right? Like, I'm gonna have to look every week, and I'm gonna know that, hey, look, if I want to buy 10 cars a week at the auction, to find the best 10, I need to have my list, and I need to be prepared to look at 100 or so cars, right? Now, again, this goes back to what I originally said. Most used car managers don't have that sort of bandwidth. They don't have the time to sit in front of the computer for 10 to 12 hours and look for those cars to come up empty-handed. So that's where you see time and time again that bad decisions are made, right? Like, I talk about this, like, there are several versions of used car managers. There's the used car manager who just loves the auction. There's that, rental car used manager that I can pick up a list and I can negotiate with any rental agent and get a car bought and get it cheap. And then there's the guy who says, you know what, I can get cars direct from consumer. I don't need any of those other sources. Well, the reality is the most effective used car managers are a combination of all of those.
Sure.
The most effective used car managers can hold their own in any one of those channels. But more importantly than being able to hold your own in those channels is being able to track the channels of which you're buying and track the profitability. And so that's something that we've embraced as an organization, is that, look, when I sit down with a dealer, there is no hiding how the cars that we buy you are performing, because we're putting it on paper. We're tracking all of your information for you because we want to know, but it's important that the dealer has an understanding as well, because you may be saying, hey, Frank, I don't want any more cars at auction, but you may look at my team and go, but man, those guys, every time they go to the auction, they're buying cars and they're profitable and they rival some of the other channels that I'm buying from. So let me pull away from those channels where I'm not being profitable and put more energy and more attention into auction or, service drive or appraisal lane or whatever the channel is where you need to focus your attention. Now, more than likely, the most profitable channel is always going to be your direct from consumer channel. We know that. So where do you want to focus the majority of your time? There. But if you're a dealer who says, well, I'm going to focus on offsite auctions because I love going to auctions, you've ignored your most profitable channel. So that's where, whether it's, my organization, any other organization out there, leaning on those organizations to say, hey, look, I need some help. I need help because not because I can't do it. I need help because I need to focus my time and energy over here and not on this channel that is not the most profitable channel. I know that I can be profitable there. It's just not my most profitable.
Well, and I think that brings up a great point to kind of put everything kind of in a bow is, one is process, right? You have to have one. And as I've said it in everything that I've done, speaking engagements, anytime someone brings that word up, is processes are black and white, guidelines have gray areas. And so you have to have that process. But like you said, okay, so you ignore the most profitable center, and maybe it's service, maybe it's off the street purchases, maybe it's trades. Every store, I would agree. I would probably say your direct from consumer is more profitable in some bandwidth because that could be trades or the service drive. But I think that you can be not as profitable, but you can be profitable with the right strategy and process with the auctions.
That's right.
And I think rentals are probably the hardest segment to be profitable with, but they serve a purpose. As long as you understand what that purpose is, right? They are traffic drivers. They are they're your cheap seats or whatever it may be. But I think that's interesting to okay, so looking at the position differently, being that combination of all three, understanding the auction, the rentals, the private party, is when you're putting teams together, or that used car person is, like you said, it takes time. Well, I mean, if you thought about auction takes time, which it does. Anyone that thinks that effectively buying at the auction takes time. Because if you just go in there, like you said, cold, and you're just looking at cars and you're just shooting from the hip, I guess it doesn't take as much time, but I'd love to see the guy that's doing that and making money.
Right.
What about private party? You think, okay, so you're going to follow up, take a sales guy, just a simple sales guy, and his follow-up leads and all the leads he gets and opportunities, and yes, that's follow-up. What makes people think you're doing anything different from the buying side? The conversation's different. The follow-up strategy is different. The how you go about it, the experience is definitely different, but you still have follow-up. And so if you're a used car manager and saying I'm going to handle the private party, I do auctions on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, but I'm going to do private party the other days of the week. So you go through and you sift through and you kind of do whatever system how effective do you think that's going to be if you're not then following up with the conversations and then have a follow-up strategy, which is no different than what you're doing. You're just doing it in the research phase because you don't have to contact customers, but you're constantly I got Sunday night, boom, I got to get my list. And then every day I'm going after these cars. It's the same thing. There is a follow-up pipeline of how do we get these cars? My guess is you're even watching that car ran 3 times, better chance of acquiring it now. Because again, there is this methodology, there's this process of consistency, which if we wrapped everything up in a bow, I think we could easily say that consistency might be the scariest word for dealers in America of today, because they're like, oh yeah, we have a process. And great, print it out and let me see it. And they're like, well, see, the thing is, or you say, okay, if I went and talked to you, then you talk to me and you talk to 4 other people and you say, what's the process for buying cars, selling cars? It doesn't matter. Pick a subject. We're going to get 4 very radical answers. And I think if they bring a you in, if they said, Darrell, we want you to build a buying center or a private party acquisition strategy, and you're handling the auctions, which would be the best of both worlds. It's okay, we're going to deliver consistency. It's but you guys can't decide to bail out or change or do something different. No, this is how this works. It only works because we deliver this consistent model, because if we just shoot from the hip, that's what our results look like too. Sometimes they might be good. And then a lot of times we miss, right? If you think of the Westerns, right? The old school, we're going to go 10 paces and shoot, with a ball and a powder gun. It's turn sideways. You're going to miss 10 times out of 10. And it's that
one of the biggest opportunities.
Yeah. And so, and that's the other thing is used cars touches every piece of a dealership, right? So kind of wrapping things up is New cars doesn't. You PDI a new car, so you get your 20 minutes of PDI, but that's it. You're not doing parts and service on it because it's new. You have to sell it to get action. Used cars touches everything. Every piece of your store is profitable. So I challenge everyone. I will tell you when I build acquisition strategies. Okay, Frank is the first person after I met him is like, hey, if they they need auction as well. I'm going to be like, hey, you guys can go do it. But I would immediately tell you guys to go to Frank because they have a system in place that shows results. And he's got heavy hitters that have data, and data rules everything. But if used cars touches everything and influences profit from every piece of your statement, how come it's not the number one focus of your dealership? Why is buying cars 2, 3, 4, or 5 on the focus list? Because you can't sell what you don't have. And if you have the right stuff, profit's never a problem. Right. And that's really what it comes down to is if you want to make profit, invest in the opportunity, invest in those partnerships of getting you to where you want to be and learning, like dive in, learn it, understand it, right? Be in a mastermind, find some classes you can take, like whether your store pays for it, you invest in it is you really need to figure out how do I get better at this? You're a GM that just took a job, but you don't really know used cars. Get in a mastermind group. You just got into a used car director job and you understand maybe you were from the buying center and you were doing private party, but you don't understand auction. Reach out to Frank. Why wouldn't you?
That's the piece. Consistency and not deviating, right? So, one of the pain points that I've seen happen to multiple dealers, and this is, if it were just one, I'd say, oh, it's a one-off. But this has happened time and time again, where the buying team, my team of, experts that have been in the industry for years and years and years, they're out there, they're searching, they're combing every channel to find you the right car. They can't find them. They can't find them at the price point. And then all of a sudden, I look at the charts and I go, wow, how did we buy 10 cars? Where did those 10 come from? Oh, I got a call. This rental guy, he called me and he told me I had a great deal. And so I bought these 10. Or I took these 10 cars in, and they were all off lease. And it's like, well, didn't we agree that your nameplate wasn't really working for you? And so we were going to not buy those cars because we knew what cars we really needed. Well, yeah, but I needed to get cars on the lot. And that's where that is, to me, is the kiss of death. When you say, I need to get cars on the lot. That tells me that we went away from a consistent plan of pumping cars in methodically every week, right? We have a plan. If it's 28 for the month, we need to buy 7 cars a week, 1 car a day. And it needs to be consistent so that we don't tie up the shop. We don't tie up, the transportation. We don't have this backlog that we create because we decided to go out and buy cars that we thought made sense. I'll touch on that rental car piece in closing and say this. When you think you're getting a great deal on a rental car, ask yourself the question, do you think that CarMax, Carvana, Echo Park, large franchise dealer, did they get that list first to comb over it ahead of time before that list made it to you? Or were you the best friend of that rental car guy and he came to you with that list first?
That's a great way to look at it. And I would say when, as we're closing this up is when we're talking about that consistency is, let the plan work and let the plan fail, right? Either one, right? Like it's going to work or it's going to fail. But when I say let the plan fail is if it starts to look like you need cars, you're making a panic decision, we need them on the lot, which I hear all the time. It's funny you said that because it kills me every time I hear that, is we had to make this radical decision. Then get on a phone call and say, hey, we need to modify the plan because we need more. Like just change the plan to move forward. Do not be reactive, right? Plans always work better when everyone's on the same page. When you make reactive decisions, everyone then is thrown into chaos. And it's not saying people can't adjust, but why are you adjusting something that could have been proactive, right? Always be proactive and less reactive because that's where we're going. If you react to something, there's not typically, I'm not going to say every time, but there's not a lot of thought put into a reaction. It's a reaction. If you think about it, say, hey, let me call Frank real quick. Hey, God, we sold 9 cars. We only sell 4 normally. Like is there any way you can get his car? It's like, oh, so we need to go from 7 to 10. No problem. We'll adjust right now. We'll get on it. Right. It's not a hard conversation. And yes, I get it. There's a 2 or 3 day time where you're like, hey, we don't show anything, or we may not have anything, or we're a little thin. That 2 or 3 day time is much better than making a reactive decision that gets you 9 cars in your example that then goes 60 days aged. And how much did that cost you? If you put a pen to paper on the aged mistakes you make, it will always cost you in the reactive decision and rarely cost you the same amount or any money when you're proactive about the approach.
Yes.
So guys, as we're wrapping up here, guys, I hope, and if you didn't, okay, rewatch this, re-listen to it, and take notes, because the amount of truth bombs and just industry knowledge Frank was giving is one. I mean, just a couple of things he said, just the way they look at it, the thought process, right? How much it aligns with that off the street purchase situation with like treating the auction. You're treating it the same way, right? You have some power bandwidth over here at the auction that keeps your name intact, which think about that one from that is he can make any offer he wants and he goes home and there's no harm, no foul. You do off the street purchases, you're building a brand. So yes, you have to be competitive, but you also have to understand that you have a brand to protect too. So there's different caveats to each lane or each segment. And that's why you need them both, right? These are reciprocal or they work in tandem. They are not enemies. What ends up being the key question about auctions is, do you have a consistent, dialed in facts-based strategy? Or are you the person that's using the auction as I have no choice, right? And you're putting yourself in that position, right? Let's do it smarter, not harder. And again, Frank, I thank you for being here. I think it's an absolute pleasure. I would expect that you're probably going to get referrals from stuff I do and other people, because what you're doing, I think, is great. And the auction, the harder it gets, and when I say harder, the compression, it takes people that really understand it, because you're fighting not just a smaller market, but we're fighting the compression on top of it, which when you start getting into the facts and science, that's the way, I don't say you beat it, but that's the way you maintain it until we actually break through, right? And if you can beat it, great, right? But I appreciate you being here. I wish you nothing but success with unique auto sourcing in the future. And as you're powering through, hopefully I see you at Used Car Week. If not, I'm guessing I'll see you at NADA, because I would imagine you guys will be there. And anything before we wrap this up, Frank?
No, Darrell, I appreciate it. Again, Darrell just comes with a wealth of knowledge and has been doing this for quite some time. So, like I said earlier, pleasure meeting you at Used Car Palooza and continuing the conversation. Again, I always end everything that we talk about with acquisition, acquisition, acquisition. It is the single most important thing that we can do. If we buy a car wrong, it never gets right. It doesn't matter how good your F&I is. Doesn't matter how good the sales team is. Invest the time and the energy into building an acquisition plan that will last, not something that's here today and gone tomorrow.
And you guys, that's what we would call street smarts, directly from the street, with Frank Knox, Darrell Steed here on Street Smarts podcast. And I appreciate you guys listening.